Hello and welcome. I'm Jonathan Tepperman, managing editor of Foreign Affairs magazine, and this is Foreign Affairs Focus. We're delighted to have with us today one of the most intrepid and physically courageous journalists working today, Nick Kristof, columnist for the New York Times. Nick recently returned from the Nuba Mountains in Southern Kordofan, Sudan, where he documented atrocities being committed by the government and is here to talk to us about them. Nick, briefly tell us what's going on.
Well, there is an insurgency in South Kordofan, and the government, beginning last June, tried to crush that insurgency. And the way they do it, essentially, is to cut off all food going into the area, cut off aid access to it, try to starve the people so that they won't support the rebel army, which is the SPLM North, and in addition, bomb the area, essentially to break the will of the Nuba people. And so we have an area that is sealed off from the outside world, is being starved, and is being indiscriminately bombed.
Now this is only, some 9 months after the creation of South Sudan, which it was hoped would stop the fighting in the country. What's happened? Why hasn't that worked? And is this a related conflict or not?
This is a related conflict. The Nuba Mountains were historically tied in many ways to South Sudan, but the agreement to separate South Sudan from North Sudan left two areas effectively in the north, and one is Southern Kordofan and the other is the Blue Nile area. And in both of those areas we have these insurgencies. They're unhappy with being part of the Bashir regime in the north. And so they're fighting, and the government is responding to those insurgencies pretty much the same way it has responded to insurgency in Darfur and insurgencies in other areas by using every bit of force, including against civilian populations.
And what ultimately is this conflict about? Is it about resources in the way that South Sudan was? Is it about agricultural land as Darfur was? What's at issue here for the north as well as for the rebels?
There isn't oil itself in Southern Kordofan. The pipeline that carries oil, when there is oil flowing, does go through the area. So it's strategically very important to control that pipeline. But really it's about the aspirations of the Nuban people for some kind of autonomy. They're completely distrustful of the government. They don't want to be a part of it. They're trying to overthrow it. And the government of President Bashir is fighting for its life and doing anything it can to try to crush that insurgency. And that's what it's about.
And what's the balance of forces at the moment? In which way is the momentum heading?
It's really hard to say. And I go in and I see these various folks with guns and see these planes in the air. In the Blue Nile area, the insurgency essentially was not exactly crushed, but it no longer controls ground. On the other hand, in Southern Kordofan, the rebels have essentially held the lines ever since last June, and so they're holding ground. Now, the government controls the air, so every hour or so, you see these bombers, these Antonov bombers flying overhead. You hear them first, and then periodically they will drop a bomb by just rolling it out the back. It serves no military purpose, but it kills people, it injures people, it terrifies people. It means they can't plant crops because they're afraid to be in their fields. And so the government controls the air, and in terms of ground lines, it's pretty much a stalemate at this point.
As abhorrent as it is morally, from a military standpoint, is it effective in any way to kill civilians or to starve them as the government's doing?
It probably is indeed to some extent, because there is less food being grown in Southern Kordofan. That also means that this rebel army, the SPLM North, has less food, that there are more people who are fleeing the area and going to refugee camps in South Sudan, which in a sense perhaps means less support for them. So it may indeed serve some military purpose, but at a terrible, terrible cost.
Now, the war crimes indictments against the president and most recently against the defense minister, are these making any difference at all?
That really depends on who you ask. There is a view that these kinds of indictments sort of embarrass some Sudanese, and that encourage the idea of a coup d'etat at some point, or some kind of a uprising at some point against those forces within the regime, that they make a leader a little bit less likely the next time around to torch villages. On the other hand, there's a counter-argument that so far they've just created a nationalist backlash that has tended to embrace those kinds of elements. And my own view is it's kind of too early to say what the outcome of that International Criminal Court strategy has been. I was in favor of it. I still hope that it does create some accountability, but I think it's really too early to know.
Now, this is a ugly and very confusing conflict being fought a long way away from Washington, right next door to another conflict that Washington did expend some effort trying to bring to a close. What should the United States be doing, if anything, and what are the odds that that's going to happen?
In this kind of situation, well, as with Darfur, as with Somalia, there are, of course, no good solutions. We can encourage negotiations between Sudan and these SPLM North rebels. We can encourage negotiations between Sudan and South Sudan, and I think we should, and we have been doing that. I think those are unlikely to get very far. The crisis that is going to be confronting us in the next 2 months or so is that food is running out in the Nuba Mountains, and people are going to be starving. You're going to have, unless things change, a famine in the Nuba Mountains, and at that point, there will be pressure to act, and we can address that by trying to bring in food. Well, we could airdrop food. We could position food in the south and rely on private traders to try to bring it in. We could punch a humanitarian corridor into the area and try to bring it in. We could also cripple runways from which these bombers take off, or take out some of their Antonovs to discourage them from these bombings, which are the main reason why the Nuba Mountains are not feeding themselves. And my view is that all these options are pretty awful, but if the choice is, and I think it is, that there are going to be tens of thousands of people starving in the coming months, that I would be inclined to take some of the more robust options. I don't think the others are going to achieve much.
And do you see these actually happening?
I think that there will be a major humanitarian effort to bring in food. I think that I've been actually quite impressed by the degree to which folks in Washington and the UN are very aware that food is running out and that there is going to be starvation there. And so I think that there will be an effort to address it. Historically, the problem has been that the kinds of measures one talks about are too modest and they alleviate a situation, but they don't resolve it. And I guess I'm nervous that the same will be true this time, that we will save some lives, but that there will be an awful lot of people who are going to starve to death in any case.
Nick, we have time for one more question. You snuck into Sudan, into South Kordofan. How did you do it, and what would have happened if you'd been caught?
I went to South Sudan and just took a vehicle camouflaged with mud, so it would be a little harder for the bombers to see, and just drove across the border into Sudan, into the Nuba Mountains without a visa. There are two main things you worry about. One is getting bombed. It helps a little bit that they don't really have bomb targeting. They just roll these bombs out. And so if they're aiming for you, you're essentially safe because they're so inaccurate. The other thing that you worry about is just running into their ground forces. And the day before I left, I just ran into some refugees who had just arrived, and their vehicle had been attacked on the same road by some Sudanese soldiers. They had been shot, and some people who'd been injured and couldn't escape had their throats cut. That certainly diminished my appetite for going there, but when I went, the Sudanese armed forces were about 2 miles away, and we had some intelligence about their location, so we were able to slip by them.
Nick, thanks so much for talking to Foreign Affairs.
My pleasure.